Hello and welcome to a special discussion on Afghanistan for The Wire. President Trump's surprise announcement over the weekend that secret talks that had been planned between the Afghan president and the top leadership of the Taliban at Camp David had been called off literally just 24 minutes before they were supposed to happen has raised fundamental questions. First of all, was a major deal in the offing, or has Afghanistan been spared being jettisoned by the United States? And what does this mean for India? Those are two critical issues that I'll explore with two of the most illustrious former ambassadors to Afghanistan, Rakesh Sood and Gautam Mukhopadhaya. Rakesh Sood, let's start with President Trump's surprise announcement that first of all that there was to be secret talks in Camp David between the president of Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani, and the Taliban leadership at something that the world simply didn't know about, and then that this had been suddenly called off 24 hours before it was going to happen. Does that give you the impression that there was a major deal in the offing, or is that an exaggerated interpretation?
I think the contours of the deal had already been spelt out by Ambassador Khalilzad, in the sense that about 5,500 troops were going to be taken out over the next 4 or 5 months. In return, the Taliban would announce a ceasefire pertaining to the US and foreign troop presence. Mind you, particularly US and foreign troop presence only. Now, President Ashraf Ghani had not been very enthusiastic about this deal. He was looking for something more in terms of assurances. And so I think the idea was that Camp David could provide an opportunity where perhaps President Trump would use his persuasive powers vis-a-vis President Ashraf Ghani. Maybe he could also try some persuasive powers vis-a-vis the Taliban leadership, Mullah Brother and so on. But yes, the fact that the stage was set at Camp David was certainly a surprise, because on that there had been no previous inkling that that was what was envisaged.
Let me ask you two quick questions. A, if this had come off, would it be a major deal? And B, did you get the impression that Camp David was the setting because the president wanted to use this to claim credit and in a sense project himself, as some people have perhaps even nastily said, as a potential candidate for a Nobel Prize?
Well, Camp David as a setting was not a necessary setting in a sense. But yes, if you want to put it in terms of a setting which would merit consideration for a Nobel, then certainly Camp David sort of springs automatically to mind. So from that point of view, it was a good setting. It would also have shown the president's personal involvement. But then, as we saw, literally 24 hours before it was supposed to happen, events spun out of control and President Trump announced that he was cancelling it.
Well, let's come to the cancellation, because Gautam Mukhopadhaya, the explanation the president gave is that he was calling it off because of the fact that the Taliban had claimed responsibility for a bomb attack in Kabul on the previous Thursday, killing 12 people, including one American soldier. But the truth is that the Taliban have been carrying out terror attacks and even other forms of violence right through the 10 months that Khalilzad was negotiating with them in Qatar. And as the BBC says, 16 American soldiers have already been killed this year alone. So was this an explanation that you found credible, or was it a pretext that suggested he was trying to wriggle out of it?
Yeah, it was not so much a pretext as I think symbolic of a much larger problem, which is I think President Trump detected that the Taliban were overreaching themselves, demanding too much, not conceding anything. Of course, I don't think President Trump was really concerned about the Afghan losses, and probably the one loss was just an occasion for him to call off the deal. But I think the larger reason was, which of course has been reported, is that President Trump wanted to announce the deal at Camp David, and as something that carried his personal touch and imprimatur. Whereas in fact the Taliban insisted that it be announced first before they go to Washington. So I think that was possibly one of the points at which President Trump felt that they were demanding too much.
But isn't it interesting that he should have come to the conclusion that the Taliban were giving too little and they were gaining too much from the deal literally at the last moment?
No, I think this was actually there. There were elements of the deal that were unresolved, and one of them was the counterterrorism guarantees. In fact, I think there had been fairly intense negotiations on this whole idea about keeping a residual counterterrorism and intelligence presence in Afghanistan, which at least publicly the Taliban were refusing.
But then you're saying something very interesting, because the corollary is that they had decided internally amongst themselves to go ahead and do it in Camp David, yet there were elements that were still unresolved.
Right.
So he was taking a risk.
Yes, but I think the President Trump believes in the art of the deal, and he thought that he could pull it through.
And I suppose he also believes in his capacity to persuade
Correct.
people to agree.
Right.
Let's come, Rakesh, to the actual details of this particular agreement. They've never been officially confirmed, but practically every newspaper has reported them. And as you mentioned, in the first stage, it involved 5,400 American troops withdrawing, probably from some 5 bases in Afghanistan, in return for an assurance that Al-Qaeda and Daesh will not operate there. And as you pointed out, a very, very limited ceasefire. In the second stage, it was hoped that the Afghan government and the Taliban would sit down and talk to each other, perhaps in Oslo, leading, I presume, to some sort of peace deal. Now, the question is, do you view that collectively as a significant step forward towards resolving Afghanistan, or do you agree with the view that this is very close to jettisoning, cutting and running, and leaving Afghanistan in the lurch?
Well, it is cutting and running, to put it bluntly. But as General Mattis, the former defense secretary, said, superpowers don't lose wars, they lose interest. So therefore, what Ambassador Khalilzad was trying to negotiate.
They only lose interest when they know they're losing. When they've won,
when
they've achieved their target.
Well, all right. But they lose interest in the sense that at that stage, they need a certain semblance of optics. So there needed to be a respectable interval between US exit and perhaps eventually collapse of governance in Kabul or whatever it was.
This was surely just cover for America scuttling and leaving.
Yes, it is. But a period of 6 to 9 months, in my view, would have been an adequate period, because by that time the election cycle would have taken over and people would have... How many people remember what is happening in Libya today?
So the period...
How many people know what is happening in
So that period
Iraq?
of 6 and 9 months would have been sufficient, not just to provide cover, but for people to forget and move on.
And move on.
You, Gautam Mukhopadhaya, in an article that you've written for Outlook, and it's a fairly forceful piece, point out that if the deal had gone through, it would represent the detachment of America from the war of terror in Afghanistan, and more importantly, point out, it was prioritizing America's concern about the terror it faces internationally over the terror Afghanistan faces either cross-border or internally. How confident are you of those two?
Well, very definitely, because when the Americans came to Afghanistan, they were very clear that they actually came to prevent international terrorism. But they saw a link between the kind of government that was in place that promoted and sheltered terrorism, which was the Taliban government, and the post-Bonn constitutional government, which presumably gave much greater space for democracy, open society, and moderation. So I think there was a clear link between the two. I think what President Trump has done with this is actually break that link and not realize, and actually hand over Afghanistan eventually to the Taliban, to a group that originally harbored the Al-Qaeda. So I think in particular, the symbolism of President of the Taliban going to Camp David on the eve of the anniversary of 9/11, hosting and clinching a deal with a group that actually harbored the perpetrators of 9/11 was both shocking as well as perhaps, the stuff of drama that I think President Trump, thrives in.
And so far from this deal providing cover, it would have actually been the emblem of American defeat, because there would be the president shaking hands or embracing the very Taliban that, in a sense, were his enemies, and doing it on the eve of the 9/11 attack.
Yeah, I think it's very clear, and many commentators have pointed out that this was a negotiated withdrawal, not at all a peace agreement. And what in effect was done was peace in America at the expense of peace in Afghanistan. And that's what they tried to achieve. And really what happened in Afghanistan thereafter was Afghanistan's fault, at best with support from the Americans in terms of, the kind of military support they would have given to the Afghan National Defense.
But the Afghans were being left now to themselves, to
Correct.
defend themselves.
Correct.
And if they can't, too bad.
Correct.
Let's look for a moment, Rakesh, Sood, at what this deal would have actually meant in detail for the nature of the country Afghanistan could have become. To begin with, President Ghani would have been replaced immediately, I presume, with an interim government. Who knows what would have happened to the September 28th elections? They arguably wouldn't have been held. Then this would have presumably facilitated a path for the Taliban to come to power. And that's not a group that actually has great respect for Afghanistan's constitution, leave aside for electoral processes. And finally, it could have endangered the very democratic rights, and in particular women's rights, that Afghanistan has struggled to give itself over the last 18 years. I mean, the country would have regressed back to what it was in the mid-90s when the Taliban were in power.
Yes, I mean, a lot of gains of the constitution, of elections, of democracy, etc., that you pointed out, would have been eroded because the Taliban do not believe in elections. But then, quite clearly, the Americans had already washed their hands off this project, because the Americans, if you remember, started off by saying that there are 4 components to the so-called agreement. One is withdrawal, one is counterterrorism, namely the Taliban will cut their ties with Al-Qaeda and IS and not allow those entities to exist. The third, they said, was that there will be eventually a national ceasefire, because originally the ceasefire would only be limited to the foreign troops. And finally, there were supposed to be talks which was originally between the Afghan government and the Taliban, but then because the Taliban refused to engage with the government, they were then described as an intra-Afghan dialogue. Now, since January, it was quite clear that only 2 elements remained, because the Taliban refused to engage with the US on 2 of the elements.
And those 2 elements
were
a withdrawal, and the second was an assurance about Al-Qaeda
That's
and
right.
Daesh. And so what this has achieved...
So that meant that the Americans had already given up on the intra-Afghan by saying, oh, this is something for the Afghans to decide
and they'd
among
also
themselves.
given up on an overall national ceasefire. So what the achievement at the end of the day is, and I'm putting it bluntly, is a ability for the Americans to withdraw with some form of cover, and that's it. As for Afghanistan, they're left to regress if they do. If they don't, good luck for them. But it's a way of saying to the Afghans, we're cutting and going. And we've got the best way out for ourselves, and boys, look after yourselves now as best you can.
Well, yes, because the Americans were, as far as the Americans were concerned, once they withdrew, the war ended for them. As far as the Americans were concerned, once the Americans withdrew, and they had assurances, for whatever it was worth, from the Taliban, that Afghan territory will not be used to do terrorist strikes against the
And
US or its allies.
that's all the Americans care about.
That's all that was needed.
But
that doesn't mean that conflict in Afghanistan was going to end. And that is precisely
Except
the tragedy
that the
of
conflict in
Afghanistan.
Afghanistan was, in a sense, if not created and exacerbated by the American presence there. And the Americans, having set that particular fire aflame, were now getting the hell out of there, leaving it to blaze away on its own.
Well, the conflict,
and I'm being colourful, I know.
No, the conflict had been exacerbated by a cumulative series of errors by the Americans over the years.
It's the same thing, you're just phrasing it differently.
No, because when the Americans went in 2001, they went in with a lot of support of the international community. So there was a lot of goodwill, including from among the Afghans, when the Americans first went in 2001.
And then they created a bigger mess, and now they're getting out.
But then they did a series of mistakes.
Let's move away from the American picture, because I think the audience have a clear idea about at least the line of questioning. And I know that perhaps Mr. Sood doesn't completely agree with the line of questioning. Let me put the opposite to you. Afghanistan, as the BBC says, is a country where the Taliban control large swathes of territory. In fact, the BBC claims that in 70% of the territory, whether they control it or not, they can operate actively. Can you have any solution there that doesn't have a sizable role and presence for the Taliban? And it might not be popular to us who look at the country from the outside, but doesn't the reality of the situation mean if there's going to be a solution, it would have to be fairly sizably on Taliban terms?
Well, I think the international community recognized this as long back as 2010 at the London conference, that in fact a reconciliation process needs to be started. The fact is that between 2010 till 2019, there has been very little progress, and the reasons for that are many. While it's easy to say that the Taliban control a lot of territory, I think a lot of these facts and figures that are quoted are often in dispute and disputed. But more importantly,
dispute the fact that the BBC claims 70% is an area
I've
where
seen
they
other figures which I
operate
can't
actively.
recall right away, which actually give a completely different set of numbers for the districts that they are in control of or that they contest. And so this business about whether it's 50% or more that of the territory that they control is one thing, and I think it's in dispute. But more importantly are two other facts. One is that does not necessarily represent popular and public support for the Taliban, number one. And number two, the fact that whenever there have been serious offensives against provincial capitals and so on, whenever there have been sort of critical terrorist actions, the Afghan National Defense Forces have performed creditably. They've recovered the towns, and in almost all the cases, they have actually neutralized the terrorist attack.
Can I pick up on the two things you said, because I think they're fundamentally important? You're saying, first of all, that the capacity of the Afghan National Forces to actually defend Ghani's territory and also fight back against the Taliban is considerably greater than most people have given them credit for. And you said perhaps before that something even more important, that the popular mood of the country, perhaps even in areas where the Taliban are in nominal control, is not pro-Taliban. It's just that they're subjugated by the Taliban, but given a chance to express their own views, they would actually support democracy, women's rights, and the sort of republic the country is, and oppose the Taliban. Is that
yes,
correct?
Generally, I mean, not necessarily every part of it, but I think very recently Saad Mohseni, the director of Tolu TV, actually quoted in Christian Amanpur's program that basically all the surveys that have been conducted have shown that the Taliban really have more than 11 to 12% of public support. And a large amount of this is on account of, let's say, excesses of local commanders. Or the absence of the government, and very often the government has not been able to back local resistance. The fact is that the Afghan security forces are very badly stretched territorially.
So then the corollary to what you're saying, Gautam Mukhopadhaya, is that in fact the Americans have in their minds built up the Taliban to be much more fearsome and much more formidable than they actually are.
I agree. I think there's been a narrative that has been created about the inevitability of the Taliban that I think is questionable.
Would you agree with that the Americans are actually doing a deal with an opponent that is nowhere near as fearsome and formidable as they deem, and therefore they didn't have to bend the knee to the extent to which they had? They could have been a lot tougher if they wanted to, and the Taliban would have given in.
Well, as long as the Taliban enjoy sanctuary in Pakistan and the Americans are not going to cross the Durand line to take the battle into Pakistani territory.
But is that the fact that the Americans have no other leverage over Pakistan other than crossing the Durand line? Surely Pakistan is a country that depends upon American political assistance and economic assistance, which can be denied at so many different levels.
I think over the years we have seen that the relationship between US and Pakistan is that of a patron and a client. Now, normally in such a relationship, it is the client that is dependent on the patron. Pakistan has very cleverly, whether during the 1980s or now, reversed that equation to make the patron dependent on the client.
Again, do you remember in the tweet of the 1st of January, I think it was last year, 2018, yes, Trump took a very assertive anti-Pakistan line.
Absolutely.
But you're now suggesting that the Pakistanis have outplayed him.
Absolutely.
And you're also suggesting that even though he's aware that the Taliban are not as formidable and fierce, and there was no need to bend the knee to the extent to which that deal suggested he was willing to do, the recourse was to actually take action against Pakistan. He's unable to do that. And so rather than take action against Pakistan, he's ended up buckling to the Taliban.
Well, he has said that the talks are dead, actually.
For now.
For now.
I mean, in America, what's dead revives pretty quickly, as happened with Kim Jong.
Yes.
But it also means that he's actually accepted he's powerless to bring Pakistan to heel, even though Pakistan depends on American support, and instead he's willing, or was willing, to buckle to the Taliban, even though the Taliban, as Gautam Mukhopadhaya points out, are nowhere near as fierce and formidable. A bizarre outcome for an American president. The power that he hasn't used, and the resistance that he should have given, he hasn't given.
True.
Is this why you say in your Outlook article that in fact a no-deal exit would have been better than the deal that he was contemplating?
Well, to the extent that he is actually handing over Afghanistan to the Taliban, as opposed to, and that too as part of a negotiated deal, as opposed to the Afghans having to fight it out by themselves. But let me just, Karan, let me just go back to that previous question. You know, the Taliban being as fearsome that you talk about, the fact is that, you know, the Taliban is fighting a war by terrorist means. It is not fighting a war by the laws of war. It's fighting a war that is, you know, completely outside the laws of war. Whereas in fact, any government troop, whether it is Afghan or the Americans, do have to, you know, abide by the laws of war and cannot take recourse to terrorism. So even the kind of control that they have right now has been earned or brought by terrorist actions, not by public support.
There are some who would remember, who would say that the Americans, Vietnam, particularly My Lai comes to mind, but there are many other such instances, were capable of similar horrors even under the rules of war. Why was that not the response in Afghanistan?
Right. So that is of course possible, and I think the American forces and sometimes occasionally the NDSF also have been accused of you know, civilian casualties that were not at all necessary, but nothing like the kind of episode that you describe.
So what you're saying is that the Americans have actually fought this war metaphorically with one hand tied behind their back because they had no credible response to the fact Taliban was using terror.
No, Karan, I would go back. You know, President Obama, during his campaign trail, when, you know, the Iraq war was still live, he made this point that Iraq was a war of choice, whereas Afghanistan was a war of necessity. In Afghanistan, the theater of the war was Afghanistan, but the locus of the war lay in Pakistan. And in fact, his appointment of Richard Holbrooke as special envoy for AFPAC was related to precisely this, that in fact the way to deal with the Afghan war was through Pakistan. I think what has happened is that this particular principle has been abandoned time and again. And when the Americans have really brought pressure to bear on the Pakistanis, at least for the time being, they have been able to cooperate in the...
But we've intriguingly and interestingly come around to the very point that I was discussing with Rakesh Sood, which is that America, not just under Trump, but even earlier under Obama, fully realized that the locus of the war was Pakistan, that without Pakistani support and sanctuary, Taliban would not be able to continue for very long. And yet, even under Obama and even more so under Trump, they were unable to do anything about Pakistan. It's amazing. A superpower realizes that the problem is Pakistan. It knows that Pakistan is a client state that cannot survive without American strategic or economic support, and yet it's unable to do anything.
Correct.
Occasional rhetoric, but that's it.
Yeah, I mean, President Obama himself changed his policy, you know, by ordering the surge and drawdown, you know, after he became president. And so the American policy in Afghanistan has been repeatedly characterized by these flip-flops. One day Pakistan is an enemy, the next day they are their you know, ally.
So the hidden story behind the deal that collapsed, which we've been talking about, is not just that he was willing to bend the knee to the Taliban, but even more so that he was also recognizing that he can't stand up to Pakistan, which is why he's bending the knee to the Taliban. And therefore, this would have been, in a sense, and I don't know if this is the appropriate phrase, a double whammy for America, acceptance of inability on both fronts.
Pakistan outplayed him. Pakistan basically outplayed Trump in that sense. They were able to get the Trump administration or Khalilzad to accept less than the 4 points on which they had started. If you recall, Khalilzad had said in the outset, nothing is agreed till everything is agreed. Now that principle was also jettisoned because 2 of the 4 principles were thrown away. So eventually, as the Taliban continued their negotiation, they were able to whittle down the American position.
Because of the support they had from Pakistan.
Exactly. And because the Americans it was evident that the Americans were keen to leave, and the Taliban knew that, so they were able to successfully outmaneuver and outplay the Trump negotiating team.
Something that they wouldn't have been able to do if they didn't have either the political support and, more importantly, the sanctuary of bases in Pakistan.
Oh, absolutely.
Their strength came from the Pakistan backing they had.
Absolutely.
Which Trump knew.
Of course. So did Ambassador Khalilzad.
But could do nothing about.
No.
And Khalilzad was frequently visiting Islamabad and yet was unable to do anything.
Well, because I think the Pakistanis knew that Khalilzad was trying to deliver to his president a US withdrawal at the earliest possible.
Which they got Because if the withdrawal is the only thing he's concentrating on, he's got it. But in terms of having to lose face, he's accepted a cover to hide it from the world, but face is
Yes,
lost.
but then, Karan, I mean, the Americans have not won a single war since World War II.
That doesn't mean that you want to keep losing wars thereafter as well. I mean,
Well,
there's a limit to how much
there
any
is-
country wants humiliation.
No, but there was Vietnam, there was the Korean armistice still stands, they withdrew from Lebanon, they withdrew
You're being
from...
deliciously cynical.
they withdrew from Somalia, they
Americans
withdrew
are so
from-
used to humiliation, one more doesn't matter. All they need is a
They
thing
withdrew from Iraq in 2011.
I mean, Bajwa and Imran Khan must be gleeful with joy.
Karan, two things. I think it's not just that the Pakistanis have fooled the Americans. Actually, the Americans have repeatedly fooled themselves. If there was at all any proof required about the Pakistani ability to influence the Taliban, the very fact that this entire deal got speeded up after Imran Khan and Bajwa's visit to the United States and their conversations with Trump proves it. I mean, the argument that somehow they are helpless and they don't actually control the...
So when Trump made that statement in the Oval Office about being invited to mediate, he wasn't just talking out of turn. Some Indians said that he was actually manufacturing things and he wasn't sure what he's talking about. It was probably a deliberate attempt to keep Imran happy and to show Imran, in return for the support you're giving as far as Afghanistan and the Taliban are concerned and providing the cover for me to skittle and get out, I am grateful and I will show my loyalty in this way.
Right. But it's not at all sure that he would have, not changed his mind the next day or just forgotten it immediately
That's
after
Trump,
that.
of course.
Yes.
So what you gain with Trump, you could lose the next
Right.
day because he's not very firm.
Right.
But nonetheless, at that moment,
But-
it wasn't so much accidental
Right.
as deliberate.
Sure.
Let's come to India at this point. Would you accept that if this deal had gone through, it would have meant in the first instance Pakistan's leverage with America would have increased and its capacity to inflict terror on India would have also increased? And secondly, it would have had a hugely adverse impact on our relationship with Afghanistan.
Well, because it would have had an adverse impact on our relationship with Afghanistan because we wouldn't know how the Afghan government would evolve with the growing influence of the Taliban and where would that take
Why
Afghanistan.
would we not know that? We've had that experience in the 90s when the Taliban ruled the country.
True.
And we were one of many countries that didn't
However-
even recognize that government.
I know. But I think there is one thing which we need to remember, that first of all, the Taliban of the 1990s and the Taliban of today may be somewhat different. We don't know.
Why do you say that?
Because nobody really knows that.
So we're hoping.
And well, it is just an assumption. Nobody really knows it. You need to test it out. And secondly, in the 1990s, please remember that the Taliban were recognized by only 3 countries. They were not seen as a legitimate government. They had come to power on the back of Pakistani tanks and guns. This time, they were actually coming to power at the negotiating table in Doha, sitting across the table from Khalilzad.
But only because of Pakistani support behind them.
Correct. But they had also been invited to China, they'd been invited to Russia, they'd been invited to other countries, to Oslo, and so on and so on. And this time...
So all of this gives you
they-
credible reason to believe that the assumption that the Taliban might not be so bad the second time round is
No.
hope.
All I'm saying is that this time if this deal had gone through and let us say through the back door, they had come into some form of interim government over a period of time, they would have not had the same dependency for legitimacy on Pakistan as they would have today, because there are, say, 50 embassies in Kabul today, all of whom would have dealt with the interim government.
I can see the reason why you believe there is some hope or possibility
hope.
that Taliban 2 would be better than Taliban 1. But I'm struck with the thought that this is a bit like saying, I got bitten by the tiger the last time I walked into his den. Who knows, he might change his mind and not do it if I go in a second time. I mean, this is hope against
his stomach
experience.
may be full.
But this is hope against experience.
Well, it is, but then things evolve. I mean, nothing, history does not actually repeat itself. Yes, there are certain similarities, but it doesn't necessarily, because this Taliban, even then, the Taliban was not happy about its dependency on Pakistan. This time, when they enjoy legitimacy, where 50 embassies are willing to deal with them sitting in Kabul, then they would they might turn out to be a slightly more different. Let's always remember that there is a strong nationalist streak in the Afghan. And this is something that I think we would do well to remember.
Rakesh Sood, for a variety of reasons, insists upon seeing the silver lining and not so much the cloud in the middle. Would you agree?
Circumstances have changed. I don't only mean the fact that they have, they are recognized much more by the international community. I think there are other elements in Afghanistan today, not least the ISIS. And definitely...
but they undermine Taliban rather than strengthen Taliban.
Right, but in some respects, many of these extremist groups are, after all, they are kindred. I mean, they are cousins, if not in-laws. And the ability of even the Taliban or perhaps even Pakistan to be able to control all the chess pieces on the board would be significantly reduced. So that means that the Taliban would once again remain dependent on Pakistan. And Pakistan would, of course, use that dependency as much as it could, even as Pakistan may be playing with some of the other players as well.
So what's your conclusion? That we do or we don't have as much to fear of the possibility of Taliban returning?
No, we definitely have a lot to fear with the possibility of Taliban return, not just because of the Taliban, because I think any change from the current state will mean a slippery constitutional slope and an ultimate descent into civil war, because none of the agreements will hold, none of the parties have the capacity to be able to control all of Afghanistan. So all of Afghanistan would, in some sense, return to a period of a kind of civil conflict. And please don't think
which is a terrible situation for us, because of the fact it can influence the possibility of terror into Kashmir.
Yeah. But please don't think that the so-called present constitutional order, the new generation that has grown up in the last 20 years or 18 years, will simply sit back and accept Pakistani tutelage and Taliban rule forever. There's bound to be resistance, and because no resistance will be able to completely overcome Pakistan and the Taliban, there will be a state of war in Afghanistan for that period.
We're coming to the end of the discussion. Let me ask you this. What do you think is the future of the deal? Is it shelved or is it scuppered? And I ask that because although President Trump has said, and so did Mike Pompeo, that the deal is dead, his capacity to rejuvenate the dead, as he's done with Kim Jong-un, is huge. So is it dead forever? Or might there be some form of resurrection down the road?
Well, I think if you remember, Karan, President Trump had said when he announced his South Asia policy, he said, my original instinct was to get out. But then he was prevailed upon, and so he announced his policy. So gradually again, that instinct of his to get out had again surfaced, and that is exactly how this deal was progressing. Now, there was this element of overreach. There was partly the optics, as Gautam pointed out, of very close to 9/11 anniversary and Camp David, which didn't look very good. And then suddenly there was also a certain amount of, I think, infighting taking place in Washington, in the sense that Pompeo had expressed some reservation about the way this deal was coming about.
Or so Time magazine claimed.
Yes. We also know that National Security Advisor John Bolton...
But you're coming close to suggesting that when the optics change and with a bit more time to resolve the internal administration problems, he could still go back to the deal. In other words, this is not a door that's closed.
Well, let's look at Trump's options. One option is he can increase the pressure on Pakistan. Okay. Second option is...
He hasn't done it in the past. He's unlikely to do it now.
Theoretically, okay. Second option is he'll say, all right, my original instinct was to get out. I will now get out, deal or no deal, and just packs and leaves.
Without a deal?
Even without a deal.
That means without any face cover either.
Well, that is part of this thing. Or he has to find that the Taliban give him a face saver, and then a deal gets revived in some fashion where he says,
this deal was the face saver. You're now saying he needs to find a better face saver.
I mean, some assurances with regard to a ceasefire, perhaps, because after all...
But if he couldn't get that from them the first time round, what are the chances he can, forgive my language, screw them for a better deal?
Well, Khalilzad is a good negotiator. Let me put it like this.
He hasn't proved to be so far. He sold the house in turn for just a...
Khalilzad, the agreement, to be fair, the Taliban had not committed to a ceasefire during the negotiations. They had said that the ceasefire will kick in once the deal is signed. So, to that extent, these attacks that have been going on were actually had been countenanced, including by the Trump administration.
Before we get lost in detail, you're therefore saying you have good reason to believe that if Trump were to look for a better cover from the Taliban so that he could get out, he could secure it. And that Khalilzad, you do believe, has the credentials of a good negotiator who can deliver that better deal. Even though he hasn't delivered it this time round, next time round he can.
Oh, sure.
What in these circumstances of uncertainty, we don't know whether the deal is dead, whether it will revive, we don't know whether negotiations will continue, whether a better deal can emerge. So in this situation of uncertainty, what should India's policy be?
See, one thing that has changed, and I think for the time being the deal is dead, it can come back tomorrow in another form, but one thing will change between this period and then. One of the crucial things that we haven't touched on was the timing of this announcement and the scheduling of the intra-Afghan talks before the elections. The effect of that, together with the attacks that were taking place, would have been that the Afghan presidential elections scheduled for September 28 would have become meaningless. Now, what this calling off, this suspension of talks has done is it actually created a window for the Afghans to actually be able to hold the election, and then from there perhaps actually pick up the threads for a genuinely Afghan-led, Afghan-owned and hopefully Afghan-controlled talks, except for the fact that Afghans are terribly weak, are terribly dependent on outsiders to be able to help them in the current situation, and therefore extremely vulnerable. So one thing definitely what India could do is come out in full support of the conduct of free and fair elections in whatever ways possible, and not just India. I mean, this would be my sort of prescription for the international community. Now the elections are going to happen, support it, back it fully, try to ensure that it's going to be relatively free and fair, taking care of opposition concerns that perhaps the election machinery may be used to the advantage of the government, and then put together, actually what the Afghans have failed to do so far is a kind of national position in their talks for the Taliban. And so, in other words, forge together, together with the Ministry of Peace now to put together a kind of national position, and then insist, and the international community should support that next time the negotiations are directly with the Afghan delegation led by the Afghan government, or at least under the umbrella of the Afghan government.
Does that suggest that Khalilzad's role diminishes?
I think, well, it's not just Khalilzad. I think it's the entire international community, the entire pro-talk with the Taliban community that had been. The pressure should be on the Taliban, for example, to demonstrate their so-called nationalism by not taking their cue from Pakistan, but by actually reconcile with other Afghans. And not.
Do you think they're willing to do that, given that their backbone comes from Rawalpindi?
Right. So I think the military pressure cannot be relieved, but side by side, I think every instrument should be used. The route to peace to Afghanistan is through Pakistan, and every instrument that is available should be used on Pakistan to ensure, including the financial instruments that you talk about, to ensure that they control their depredations in Afghanistan.
In the Outlook article you wrote, which I talked about earlier, and admittedly you wrote it 24, 36 hours before Trump announced that these talks were off.
Right.
You suggested that this was an issue that should be given much greater and higher profile by Prime Minister Modi, that he should personally invest himself in it.
Right.
Do you still believe that to be the case?
I think that moment is lost, because the time to have done that was before the talks were suspended, and when the option was intra-Afghan talks or elections, and we should have pitched in favor of elections, which would have given hope for the future, whereas the intra-Afghan talks would have definitely led towards chaos.
Gautam Mukhopadhaya has sketched out how he believes India should play its hand in the next period hereafter. What's your feeling?
I think that elections help if elections are seen to be credible and legitimate. Now, earlier,
you don't think that will be the case?
I think that given the fact that 66 districts are under the control of Taliban out of 398 total number of districts in Afghanistan, another 192 are contested, which means the total of 258 where the government doesn't hold sway.
Which means you can't have credible elections
So
there.
out of 398, there are 258 districts where where elections are unlikely to carry weight, as it were. So then, will such elections be credible? Will they be seen as legitimate?
Can I stop
is
you
my
there?
question.
Elections were central to your policy outline for India. You just heard that there are good reasons for believing elections can't be credible. How do you respond?
No, two things. One is I think the international community should support, even to the extent of election security, meaning to say strengthen the security for the conduct of the elections. Secondly,
By sending soldiers in?
Not, well, there are soldiers already there by just using what they have more effectively.
14,000 altogether, that enough?
No, it's not just foreign troops. I mean, there is the whole ANDSF. But quite apart from that, there is the question of election observers. The international community could have strong election observers to ensure that it's as free and fair as possible. There has been
Can I talk? But is any of that sufficient to ensure that in the 250 odd districts that he mentioned, where either the Taliban are in complete control or where they contest, that you can have credible elections?
In the current context, even if you have elections in, let's say, 50% of the country, that will be taken as a barometer for the support for the Afghan constitution, for a republican constitution as opposed to the emirates.
So this is a case
even the turnout will be seen as a support, and it doesn't matter if it's not the rest of the country. The recent survey has shown that about 76% of Afghans would be willing to come out and turn out for the elections. This was before the cessation of talks, when it was a bit controversial. Come out and support the elections even at the cost of their security.
So you're saying even if you can only hold an election in 50%,
correct,
go ahead.
Yeah, it would be legitimate. It would be seen as
In other words, this is a classic case of half a bread is better than no loaf at all.
Absolutely, in my
Come back to you, because before we end, you therefore don't believe elections are credible. What then should India be looking at?
Well, I think we don't know, as you yourself said earlier on, we don't really know whether the talks will revive, whether they will not revive, whether a withdrawal will take place. I mean, we don't really know how.
So you're saying India should wait and watch?
I think we need to, in modern medicine there is a term that is used called watchful waiting. Normally when there is a complicated case, the doctors get together and before they decide on the course of intervention.
Watchful waiting is often hope and pray.
No, watchful waiting is a term that is used in modern medicine.
Where doctors don't know what else to do.
Where doctors wait to see how different things are unfolding before deciding on the intervention that is needed.
You're tarting up the fact that we don't know what to do.
Well,
let's watch and wait.
I think we need to watch and wait.
So that's your advice to Mr. Jaishankar. At this moment, don't rush to a policy, don't rush to a decision. Let the situation play and it will become obvious in due course.
Let's get a better handle on it.
Very quickly, I'm going to give you the last word. Would that be wasting an opportunity?
Yes, because sometimes you lose an opportunity. You need to take a moment at the moment that as it arrives. And I think in actually doing so, you'll actually change the dynamics. I mean, for example, if we had, and if we come out in support of the elections even now, I think it would strengthen the lobby in Afghanistan for the elections. And actually help ensure a better turnout for the elections, which means a more successful election, which also means probably a stronger government. I would also say that, this entire process of marginalizing the Afghan government and the Afghan people through these entire talks has actually created a backlash of sympathy for the constitutional order, which people will support.
So you're suggesting India should grasp while the iron is hot?
Absolutely.
Even at the risk of burning its hand?
No, I don't think there is any question in this of burning any fingers or hand. Because supporting the elections is basically a motherhood. Who are you opposing? The only party that would actually go out of the way to oppose the elections are the Taliban. They are doing it anyway.
Quite right. And a democracy anyway should support
Correct.
election.
Correct.
All right, gentlemen, we've run right out of time. My thanks to both of you for a fascinating discussion on Afghanistan. And there we end this particular discussion. If you have been watching, many thanks indeed.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.